Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and 4. Pretty good stuff, huh? We'll jump right into it because it's a lot of ground to cover for one class period. But how many of you, when you started reading chapter 3, saw some familiar words in there? Anybody listen to the radio around 1965? Dale, I know, knows this. Were the Byrds one of your favorite bands in 1965? They had a number one hit song, Turn, Turn, Turn. And just the title of it may not spark remembrance, but if you turn on that song on your device or something, you're going to find that chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 is that song. Okay? And it's a song that was number one for some time. That's here nor there. It's not pertinent to the lesson today. It's a little added value. But I do like to see when mainstream America takes something out of the Bible and puts it into action. It always sounds good. What profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? The preacher asked. That's the central question as we started this study, with emphasis on the phrase under the sun. What profit has a man under the sun? Under the sun meaning what? On earth today, right? We could also, through this study, kind of paraphrase that question another way. What profit is there in life when viewed from an earthly perspective? What profit is there in life when you view it from an earthly perspective? Or, what value is there in our labor when we fail to consider God's will? When we don't take into consideration God's will for us, what value does our labor really have? So those are the questions so far that Solomon is trying to answer for us in this book. And he's already came to his conclusion. And he came to his conclusion, and it was what? All is vanity. Right? When I don't take God into consideration, when I just work for myself, what is that profit? What is that value? He says it's all vanity. Vanity meaning what? Worthless. Nothing. Without God, nothing on this life make any sense. You're going to be chasing the wind. You're going to be grasping at the wind if you don't have a firm foundation. So how did he come to this conclusion? Two things. He came to it, one, based on his personal experiences that he had as the king of Israel. And we don't want to go back and rehash too much, but he had everything at his disposal as the king of Israel, didn't he? So he had a lot of personal experiences. And what we're going to talk about today is he also had a lot of just personal observations. And so chapter 3 and chapter 4 deal with this question, in the reason behind his conclusion is all is vanity, based on his personal observations of the world and people. Okay, and so that's what chapter 3 and chapter 4 are going to explain his conclusion, which is all is vanity. So number one, his conclusion that life under the sun was vanity is partly reached by observing the inexplicable purpose of God. It's kind of an interesting way to look at it, the inexplicable purpose of God. All things serve God's divine purpose. And that kind of falls under chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And I do like the way that it starts out. To everything there's a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. And then verses 2 through 8 goes on and contrasts good and bad, contrasts life and death. And it says that everything in this world is purposed for God and has a time for it. And if you think about it in that sense, it starts to make sense to us looking at this book through Solomon's eyes, because what is the first thing that he noticed about the world? It's cyclical, right? Remember, he talked about the seasons come and go. The wind has a pattern to it. It never stops. He talked about water and the rivers that flow into the ocean, but the ocean never fills up. So there's a pattern and a process to God's creation that's cyclical in nature. And it got him to thinking, what does that mean for me as a human being? And I want you to remember that as we kind of get into chapter 4 in a minute. There's always, in his writings, they always go back to this cyclical nature that God has created in earth, and that we can't make sense out of it, right? Because in a fallen world, right doesn't always win like we think it should. 2 plus 2 does not always equal 4, right? And why is that? Because Satan is involved in this. And so when Solomon is trying to make sense, how come I can't get happy building my houses? How come I can't get happy acquiring this gold? How come I can't get happy X, Y, Z, you name it? He comes to the conclusion is because God is not centered and focused in my life. Okay? So that's everything that we're fixing to talk about from here on out. It says everything that God creates is beautiful. To your point. What is the old cliche that you hear us teach the young kids in Bible class? God doesn't make junk. Right? We say that all the time when we're teaching little kids because they understand that language. We clean that up a little bit when we're adults and we say everything that God has ever made and ever thought about in His purpose is beautiful. That means a little bit more to us than that would mean to a kid, right? Starting in verse 9 and 11, 9 through 11, we find out that God has put into man's heart the desire to search out His purpose. Right? Think about that. God has instilled in man's heart. He says, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. Verse 11, He has made everything beautiful in its time, and He has put eternity into their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. All right? Now there's other Bible verses that clear that thought up a little bit. To paraphrase, he says, God instills in man's heart the yearning to desire who and what God is. But God also makes it impossible for us to know all the thoughts of God. Right? His thoughts are not our thoughts. He is God and we're not. He set this into motion. We can't understand it. We understand the end game, but we'll never know everything. How much do we understand and know about really what is happening right now in the spiritual realm between Satan and God's angels? Jude even tells us, be careful to even talk about that because you don't know anything about it. Sometimes it's better for us to say, I don't know, instead of trying to explain something we know nothing about. Yes, we're not capable. But God has put in our heart to try to understand Him. Why did He do that? Well, the good thing is, Solomon answers that question here a little bit. And the reason why is because he wants us to study and yearn and learn to find him, because when we do, we will then develop a proper respect for God and fear for God and love for God and trust in God. So with him putting that into our heart, it leads man into his ultimate faith in God. All right? Pretty deep stuff, but you got to remember who's writing this. The wisest man to ever live, except for Christ, who was pointed out to me by somebody last time. So we have to remember, God has a plan. And his plan is summed up what? He wants all to be saved. He wants there to be no sin. He wants everyone to fear him, love him, respect him, and bring others to him. Yes. We're kind of even jumped to letter C here. Why does God act this way? God does it that men should fear him, and that's in verse 14. Or you can say to reverence God and therefore to seek to please him. Let me read to you Acts chapter 17, verses 26 and 27. Paul writes, now, he is kind of changing scenery here a little bit. He's in Athens, and he's addressing the courts, and they're talking about the unknown God. Do you remember the story in Acts chapter 17? I see that you have all of these idols, and you have an idol for everything. And I see that one over there says to the unknown God. It's to that God who I want to talk to you about today. So he's in the middle of this sermon. And verse 26 says, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. All right? Pretty good companion scripture right there. I've created everyone at specific times and specific places and instilled in him the thought that they might grope for me so they could respect me and fear me so that we could be saved. Written probably 1,000 years, close to 1,000 years after Ecclesiastes. So it's a pretty good companion scripture in Acts chapter 17. God has made man an inquisitive creature, hadn't he? Are we inquisitive by design? Of course. He's also made life such that we are always seeking for something better or for some purpose. Doesn't that kind of drive us crazy? That sometimes we have a hard time being content? How many people just want a little bit more? Just a little bit more. And a lot of times we treat this as in terms of money. And that's certainly part of what the preacher's talking about here. But it's also just everything. Aren't we a people of excess? You go down and you buy a car that's a name this and brand this and model number this, but boy, if I only had a little bit, I could maybe get the model this. We have to learn to be content, and that's part of the conclusion that Solomon's going to get to here in a minute. The preacher's conclusion. Now, this is good stuff. I've got this underlined in my Bible, and if you write in your Bible, I would suggest you do it too. Chapter 3, verse 12. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. Now, wait a minute. Solomon is saying there's no joy in my labor. Right? Solomon is saying there's no good in my labor because at the end of the day, I'm just going to die and leave it to somebody else, and I don't have any control on how they're going to take care of my possessions. So what joy is that? That's what he's developed unto right now. But he says something here. He says, basically, my conclusion is, I know that nothing is better for them, that's us, the them here is us, than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labor. It is the gift of God. He just changed the dynamic. He's now no longer looking at the fruits of our labor from an earthly perspective. He has now said the whole process of man is to work hard, whatever he achieves, enjoy it, have peace in it, because that is what God has given to you. So when you flip the equation and you're no longer looking at it in compared to my stack is this big and my neighbor's stack is this big, so I'm not happy with this. He's now saying your stack is a gift of God and your whole being is to be thankful for that, enjoy that, and rejoice in it because God gave you and blessed you with that. And if we always keep that in perspective, we're never going to fall into the earthly way of viewing materialism, possessions, you name it. And we'll never compare ourselves to others. We will always be content with what we have, knowing that God has given it to us. And he says, every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labors, for it is the gift of God. Enjoy the good of the labor. So the things that we've been given, how are we using God for us to use what we're given to help others with it? That's the joy. And if you don't have I always go back to money, I probably shouldn't do this, but some people have $100 bill to help with this situation. Somebody has $1 to help with that situation. Whatever you have, use it and enjoy it because that's what God's given you to do. Whatever I have, I'm glad to have it. So he just flipped the argument. He just said about all my labor, what profited is a man to labor under the sun for his entire life? If I look at it through humanistic eyes, it creates nothing but strife and bad things for me. But when I realize that the gift of God, whom I fear, love, trust, because God has instilled that in me, if I succumb to that, then I will be happy, good, and cheerful people. All right. Let's go to page 2. Without revelation, we cannot discern God's purposes. Without His blessing, we cannot enjoy the good of our labor. Therefore, any effort to live without God can only be vanity, as we will find His purpose inexplicable. That's a pretty good statement. It's long, it's wordy, but it's pretty good. I'll read it one more time, the top of page 2. Without revelation, we cannot discern God's purposes. Without His blessing, we cannot enjoy the good of our labor. Therefore, any effort to live without God can only be vanity, as we will find his purposes inexplicable or unexplainable. Pretty spot on, right? The preacher's conclusion about the vanity of life was reinforced by the following. So now he's made the conclusion, and now he made it through his personal experiences, and now we're finding out his observations that helped to do that for this conclusion. So he saw some things that he's going to talk about in the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4. He saw wickedness in the place of justice. Chapter 3, verse 16. He saw power on the side of the oppressor with no comfort to those being oppressed. It even prompted him to think that the dead were better than the living, and maybe the best were those never to be born. Now, remember our study of the minor prophets? There were several major problems with the nation of Israel that ultimately they had their demise, and we won't have to retrace all that. But what was one of the major problems that the nation of Israel had from start to finish? Mistreatment of people. And we kind of named that social injustice, right? Powerful people mistreating those who had no power. Backbiting. Using the law to hurt people. Using their power with the law to hurt people. Solomon's seeing it right here. He's saying, I look around and I see where there's supposed to be justice, I see wickedness. Where I see people that have power and the ability to help people, I see them actively oppressing people because it makes them feel good. And he says, this is just helping me with my conclusion. Without God in the middle of everything, all is vanity, all is worthless. This is terrible. He even goes to the point to say it's better for some people that have never been born because they don't have to deal with this. Yeah, it starts with the transformation of the heart. If we want to be Christians, we want to be the best Christians we can be. It doesn't start with washing our hair, does it? It starts with changing who we are inside. So that's a good point. He goes on to say that God, because he's seeing this wickedness and he's seeing this iniquity, and he goes on to say that God will judge the righteous and the wicked. We know that, right? Every knee shall bow at the end of the time. And he says God will somehow use injustice and wickedness in carrying out his purpose. He says that in verse 17. He'll use this injustice and wickedness to carry out his purpose. Boy, we saw that in our study of the minor prophets, didn't we? Didn't he use foreign nations, vile foreign nations, to come and overthrow the nation and punish them? So God will do that. He allows injustice to test us. All right, now I think all of us will say that we get tested from time to time, don't we? Like every day. And he uses that injustice to test us. We also find out more of that in James. Talking about trials and tribulations, the book of James. But here's the interesting observation. Why does he use that? Because in verse, let's look at 18 through 21, chapter 3. He says, I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so the other one dies. Surely they will all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from dust and will return to dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? That's pretty heavy-duty stuff. God test us so that we can know our brevity on earth, and knows that we will die one day, just like the animals do. Yet we're different. We don't just go away. We don't melt into the dust where there's nothing left for us. Our spirit, he says, goes up for judgment. We're different. But God uses that testing by the injustice of the world to keep us grounded. Pretty deep stuff here. Let's move to Roman numeral 3. In the remaining part, so we're going to finish the end of chapter 3, and then we'll spend some time here on chapter 4. We find Solomon, the preacher, making various comments about things that he's observing. They're somewhat random in nature, but he's using all this to basically prove out his theory now that says, with God involved in one's life, it's no longer vanity. In the absence of God, everything about what we're doing is vanity. With the inclusion of God, now things are worth what we're doing here. So he starts making these observations. The vanity of skillful and selfish work. He said that for someone to labor and to have success, he noticed something that was consistent about that. His neighbor, that success caused his neighbor to have envy on him. So although I'm doing great things, it caused other people problems. And then he goes on to say, and this is kind of look at chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. The vanity of selfish toil. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. Number 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. He basically says it's foolish to fold your hands and do nothing. But acquiring too much is not worth the effort because you're never going to be satisfied. Right? He's seeing this in looking at this without God's involvement in your life, and he's looking at this as you're just going to try to do it on your own. He says, well, it's foolish to fold your hands and do nothing. But then it's also foolish to acquire everything in the world that you possibly can, because without God, you're just going to have a desire to want more. So you're not going to be happy that way either. He says, what is best is to have little with quietness and contentment. And I want to read this from Proverbs chapter 15, verse 16, which Solomon wrote this as well. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 16 says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. It's better to have little with fear of the Lord than great treasure and the trouble that it brings. I think it's his way of saying, learn to be content. Where was that you quoted earlier? Paul said it.
Paul was in his discussion expression, I've forgotten which book.
Romans. I've learned to be content in my circumstance because it is the gift of God, right? Then he goes on to make this deal. He talks about being alone in the world. And this is kind of random thoughts that he has here. But he says, the preacher saw one with no companion in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 4. That person's never satisfied. Matter of fact, he can't be satisfied. In Ecclesiastes 5:10, it says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This is also vanity. You can't be satisfied if you don't have God in your life. And then he goes in to say, it's much better to have friendship. And he goes into this, verses 9 through 12, who can help each other in their labors. Friendship can help each other when one falls down. He talks more about friendship, who can help each other withstand forces. And the example he gives is, if a person comes from the outside and you're by yourself, he may be able to overtake you. But the chances are, with you and a friend, one person can't overtake you. So there's strength in numbers about having good friends. And then he goes in to address popularity. He says, popularity is such a fleeting thing. And that's in verse 13 through 16. I'm telling you, random thoughts, but good stuff here. He says it's better to be a poor and wise youth than an old foolish king. Think about that. Deborah liked that one over there. It's better to be a poor and wise youth than an old foolish king. Why? Well, think about it this way. For despite rising from property and prison to become king, the people will eventually prefer another much younger one than you. Right? So what's the conclusion here? The preacher's observation about the vanity of life, along with the wisdom for living under the sun, will continue in succeeding chapters. So we're going to continue to answer this question and prove this thing out for the next 6 chapters. All right? We've already seen in the study that he reached the conclusions about the vanity of life when he started looking at the observation of things around him. Number one, because the inexplicable purpose of God. Can't make sense of it if you're not a believer in God. Number two, the injustice and oppression of men. Doesn't make sense. And the vanity of skillful and selfish tools. I like Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 says this. And we know that all things work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. How does that filter into what we're talking about here? We know that all things work together for good to those who love God. Remember, when Solomon's looking at everything, trying to work and make sense out of it, through just earthly wisdom, he can't make sense of anything, can he? And all of a sudden, you add God into it, and everything becomes abundantly clear about, remember the questions that we're trying to answer? Why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing while I'm here? It now starts to make clear. I am here to be the best person I can be. Fear, follow, love God, and bring as many other people into that circle that I can. And that's really it. And so then you get all the way over here, maybe 900 years later into Romans, and he says, and we know that all things work together for those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Who are the called? Those who answer the call. We're all called. The called are the ones who answer the call, who say, I will allow God, Christ, into my life so I can make sense of this crazy world we live in. Talking about friendship. We all have one. If you don't have any other friend in this world, you all have one friend, don't we? That you can count on, thick and thin, good and bad. And that's Christ, right? I grabbed a couple of... through him we can obtain mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. Hebrews 4:15 and 16. John 15:14 says, you are my friends if you do whatever I command you. You see, there's always a submission to this. There's a submission in Solomon's day when I have to now submit myself to the fear of God to allow this all to make sense. Here in the New Testament, I have to submit myself to God and to Christ, do what he commands, and then it all makes sense. You know, we had to cover, I've got about 2 minutes here. I wish we had time for more discussion in this. We'll allow more time next time, but we had a lot of ground to cover. But I hope you're getting everything out of this study that I'm at. I'm learning a lot through looking at this world and looking through Scripture through Solomon's eyes. And I think we have to continue to do that. Remember, this was written in wisdom literature terms, not necessarily prophetical terms. You know, prophetical terms meaning like in the Old Testament prophets, remember, this is the law, this is where you broke it, this is how I'm going to punish you, and this is when it's going to happen. Wisdom is different. It's saying, look at what's going on. We've got to make sense of it. If you do these general truths, everything will make sense. So it's written in different language. We always have to remember, read this book in wisdom terms. Yes, sir.
Brody, I've got that scripture, and I think it would be a good addition to the end of the outline.
Okay.
It's Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 through 13. Listen. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Now here it comes. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Not a better way to end the class than that. Philippians, what was the whole thing?
Philippians 4, 11 through 13.
11 through 13, Philippians 4. Thank y'all for coming this morning. Have a great morning.